Within this debt mountain there are problems. This is not all problem debt, but there are loans out there on poorer quality assets in particular, which were extended at high loan to values, and ratios, and in particular were made during the boom when values were very high during 2005, 2007. We estimate maybe that perhaps 20 to 25% of this total outstanding debt has got these sorts of characteristics and is potentially therefore problematic for the banks. And the sorts of situations we're talking about here are second order shopping centres in second tier towns, bought at the height of the boom with huge, very, very highly geared, now struggling somewhat with vacancies in the hands of investors who are in debt up to the hilt, have neither necessarily the expertise or resources to do the necessary expenditure and so forth. So you've got a deteriorating centre in a town owned by someone who may be in serious difficulty or in danger of going into default. And some regions of the country, the northwest being one, have got quite a few of these. The biggest and previously most active lenders are now embarked on a strategy of reducing their exposure to property because they had too much, and there's going to be a very extensive period over which they will seek to work out these problems. It doesn't look as if there's going to be a flood of distressed selling. There's going to be a flow, probably. It's going to take quite a while, 3 to 5 years. Now, having said all that, we have in recent months seen some improvement in the supply of debt and credit conditions for lending. There are more banks active in the market, in particular, increasing number of German banks wanting to lend. But in the main, as with investors or managed funds, they are selective, and the lending criteria are relatively conservative. Again, they want to lend money on secure assets, which is adding to the repricing pressures at the better quality end of the market, while leaving secondary property values still rather fragile. In the commercial office market, the occupational market trends, then one of the positive features of the recovery phase from the downturn is that we this time around have much less oversupply from new building compared, for example, to the early 1990s, where there was a huge surplus, huge overhang of space. That largely is itself a product of the credit crunch, which acted very early in the downturn to choke off finance for new schemes, and so for the last 2 years had very little new development. And indeed in some markets now, London being one, we're beginning to see shortages of new space appear. The central London market in particular has shown quite a robust pickup over the last 6 to 9 months. Demand has returned, particularly in the internationally orientated sectors of the London economy, and rents are now beginning to show signs of rising again. But if we look outside of London, just as near as the rest of the southeast, and certainly if we go out to the major regional centres, we still find a much, much more subdued picture. No great signs there of demand strengthening at the moment. Rents, at best, stabilising. Incentives pretty generous. And if you go to some of these markets, really quite weak conditions. And looking forward, certainly in major regional centres, there's a significant question mark about demand in these markets for office space going forward, in particular because of their previous pretty high reliance on the public sector. Over the last 2 years, the single largest sector of demand in the 7 largest regional centres in the UK has been the public sector, accounting for nearly a quarter of all office space take-up. In Birmingham last year, it was 50%. In Liverpool last year, it was 50%. And if that pattern of demand is going to change going forward, which is quite likely that it will, then there's a significant question mark raised over some of these office markets. And the other indicator that out there in the region's office markets might have some problems is reflected in this chart, showing simply the total amount of office space in these 7 cities in their central business districts on the market, which you can see is at a high level, certainly the highest level shown on this chart. You have to go back to the early 1990s. Now, this is not all newly built office space awaiting its first tenants. A large amount of this, actually, is lesser quality space of varying grades, some of it actually probably almost unlettable maybe. That these centres in particular have got a long tail of secondary and tertiary quality property sitting in their city centres for which the market prospects are extremely poor. I was up in Liverpool last week, where for the first time I've seen this, on a main street in the middle of the central business district, on a large building, there were two boards offering rent-free offices. I thought it was quite a good indicator of the state of the market there. For these second-hand, older buildings, basically just take it off my hands, with the landlord is saying, you pay the rates, because I've got to pay empty rates. Similarly, we're seeing significant regional differentiation in the retail sector, and this chart just summarising the change in the course of 2009 in prime high street shop rents. Now actually last year central London shop rents rose, and in some places in central London, Bond Street and so forth, so quite strong increases. But look at the scale of those falls last year, in some places reaching 20% in some of our major high streets across large swathes of Midland, Northern England and Scotland. Retail health, the health of retail markets varying widely. And looking forward, there is serious concern in the retail sector in general and the retail property market that it may well be that retail has so far, which has proved perhaps surprisingly resilient, has had a phony recession. There is real concern about the impact of the post-election squeeze. Stuart Rose talking about M&S customers know there is tough medicine to be taken, and retailers are worried that taking that medicine is going to hit them. We're also seeing the emerging trend of much stronger regional and local differences in retail health, and the emergence of continuation and reinforcement of this best versus rest differential. If you're in big destination shopping locations, the biggest shopping centres with the biggest catchments, vacancies are low, still trading well. The further you go away from that, the weaker, more fragile, more patchy is the picture, and an increasing problem of secondary and tertiary stock obsolescence. We've seen a big rise in vacancy in the recession. As the tide goes out, it leaves behind a lot of older, poorly located, badly configured retail property that basically nobody wants. At the same time, we've got very little now new development going forward comparatively. Some stirrings of some new shopping schemes, but an awful lot have been put on hold. The blight of higher shop vacancies is evident across many towns and cities and suburban locations. It is fundamentally a problem of too many of the wrong type of shops. They're in the wrong places, they're in the wrong size, they are not suited in the main to modern retailing. And the answer to them is not, the answer to this problem is not, I think, to seek to preserve or to re-let them. Many of these actually should have a change of planning status and be opened up to other uses. Many of them, in fact, are invasions of previous residential property and should probably go back to being residential properties in the future rather than being trying to preserve. In commercial development, we're now beginning to see renewed interest, more players looking to take schemes forward, the stirrings of an increase in activity. But inevitably, as so often happens, as you're in a recovery phase, activity will be focused on the stronger and more established locations first, where there is less risk. Overall, development still facing a number of constraints, foremost of which is access to finance, which not everybody can secure. In fact, we've seen very, very little lending for development activity. The viability of schemes still variable and has reduced as property investment yields have moved higher because that reduces the end value. Still, in many markets, developers facing uncertain tenant demand and rental prospects, and that's more likely to be the case in regeneration areas. They're more concerned about the risk of voids, and the costs of empty rates has clearly substantially increased those risks. If there's one factor that one regularly comes across, particularly in areas of regeneration, that is having a deterrent effect upon the initiation of new development, it's empty rates. And the burden and the problem and the hurdles of planning conditions and planning obligations. And we do seem to be still in a period where, far from encouragement, openness, stimulation, the hurdles, the barriers to be crossed in the planning system are increasing.